This is Sustainable Voices, where ideas for a better future speak loud.
Hello and welcome to another episode. I'm Lea, one of your hosts, and today I'm joined by my colleague Adriana. Hi, Adriana.
Hi, Leah. Hi, everyone listening. We're really glad you're here. Today, we're talking about tiny houses and more specifically about how they influence psychological well-being.
Tiny houses are often discussed as a sustainable or architectural trend, but from an environmental psychology perspective, they are much more than that.
They raise important questions about how space, lifestyle, and well-being are connected. But before we dive into those questions, let's take a step back and look at what we actually mean when we talk about tiny houses.
Tiny houses have become a familiar image on social media, in documentaries, and in lifestyle magazines. But once you look closer, even defining a tiny house isn't as simple as it seems.
Yes, several questions arise. Are they permanent buildings or mobile units? How small is tiny? Which construction types count? Most researchers use the broad guideline that a tiny house is usually less than 37 square meters in size, regardless of whether the house is on a foundation or on wheels.
Academic research on tiny houses does exist and is growing, but when we ask a basic questions, how many tiny houses are actually out there, clear answers are still hard to find. And that's not because nobody cares. The challenge lies in definition. Tiny houses aren't consistently classified in legal or statistical systems.
Take Germany, for example. Many researchers describe it as Europe's most active tiny house country, yet there's no reliable official statistic.
Without shared definitions, tiny houses don't appear as a separate category in housing statistics.
What we do know is that the modern tiny house movement first gained real momentum in the Anglophone world, especially in the United States, where tiny houses became a popular alternative housing method.
From there, the movement spread to countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, shaping today's global tiny house culture.
At the same time, the desire to live small isn't new at all. It has historical roots reaching back to the 19th century.
And mobile tiny dwellings existed long before today's trend, from European builders to early house trucks.
So tiny houses may look like a modern phenomenon,
But they're also a reinterpretation of long-standing ways of living. Tiny houses are therefore not just a housing trend or an architectural curiosity. They represent a broader shift in how people think about space, consumption, and everyday life.
this makes tiny houses a particularly interesting case for environmental psychology because they combine physical space with values, behavior, and well-being.
That leads us to the central question of today's episode. How does living in a tiny house enhance psychological well-being through minimalism, autonomy, and connectedness to nature?
And to understand this question not only theoretically, but through lived experience, we will now speak with Marina and Patrick, who embody tiny house living in their everyday lives.
We are happy to welcome our guests today. Thank you so much for joining us and for taking the time to share your everyday experiences of living in a tiny house. Before we dive into the interview, we'd love to give you the space to introduce yourselves. So, Marina and Patrick, the stage now is all yours. Please tell us who you are, what you do, and how did you come to live in a tiny house?
Hello, thank you for having us. So my name is Marina. I'm 32 years old, and yeah, I'm self-employed. I'm working as a kinesiologist and teaching Yin yoga. And yeah, we live together in our tiny house. Um,
Yes, thanks for having us. My name is Patrick. I'm 33 years old and I'm working as an architect. We came to live in a tiny house because we wanted to move to Austria for working there. And we found out that it's very expensive to find a flat there. So we decided so we tried to find some solutions how to save some money. And we thought about bringing our own home with us. It was way easier to find a site to build on than finding a flat that is not too expensive.
When we talk about minimalism in environmental psychology, we're not just referring to a lifestyle trend or an aesthetic preference. Psychologically, minimalism describes the conscious reduction of possessions and a shift away from materialistic values toward more intrinsic ones, such as personal growth, relationships, and meaningful experiences. Research by Mongold and Chow shows that people who adopt a tiny house lifestyle often do so precisely because they want to move away from materialistic consumption and toward a more intentional way of living. More generally, studies on materialism indicate that placing strong value on possessions is associated with lower life satisfaction, higher stress levels, and increased social comparison. On a daily level, this can result in mental overload and decision fatigue because more belongings also mean more choices, more maintenance, and more cognitive demands. In contrast, the work of Ford and Gomez-Lanier found that tiny houses often function as a structural trigger for minimalism. Because space is limited, people are forced to prioritize what they own and what they let go of. This enforced prioritization has been linked to positive psychological outcomes, such as greater mental clarity, reduced stress, and a stronger focus on experiences rather than material ownership. In this sense, tiny houses can be understood as a minimalism amplifier. Less space leads to fewer possessions, fewer daily decisions, and often to a more intentional and psychologically supportive way of living. With this in mind, we'd like to explore how minimalism is experienced in everyday life by our guests. So let's start with minimalism. Marina and Patrick, does minimalism play a role in your life? Have you noticed a change in context of minimalism since moving into a tiny house?
Yes, I think it plays a very important role in our lives, and I think the significance has increased definitely since we moved into the tiny house because, yeah, I mean, you have to, yeah, very consciously reduce your belongings. Even before we moved in, we sold a lot of our things, and we just focused on the really important stuff that you really need in your day-to-day life. And yeah, I mean, because the tiny house is built on the trailer, we have limited space, and yeah, so we have to be honest. So we have still some belongings at my mother-in-law's place. For example, we need to swap our jackets during the seasons. It's really important to really focus on what's really necessary.
That sounds great. Can you tell us a bit about how has reducing your possessions and living more minimally affected your daily mood and your sense of clarity?
Yes, for us, living with fewer possessions has, in generally made us feel more comfortable because the small space has a really positive effect on our moods. But sometimes when you live in that very small space, disorder becomes very visible quickly.
So living with fewer possessions has generally made us feel very comfortable and at ease. The tiny house feels very, very cozy and it's our safe space. And I think this has a very positive effects on our mood. And yeah, the space is really small, so it kind of gets messy if you just don't tidy up often. So for example, if you're not cleaning the dishes right after eating, then it can feel a little chaotic, and this of course sometimes leads to stress and feeling irritated. So but overall I think having fewer things brings more clarity and a stronger awareness of how the surrounding also affects our emotional state. So of course we feel a lot better if it's clean and tidy.
Thank you for sharing that. Do you maybe know how has that shift influenced your happiness? Are you happier now living with with less stuff, or did you were maybe more happy before when you did have like more things and possessions?
To be honest, to reduce our possessions has made me more happy than having all of that before, because now we are more and more shifting toward thinking about things having at home, because where do you put them? What do you do with them? And if we go to the shop and buy new things or thinking about buying new things, it's always the question, do we really need it? Or is it just something what we will use temporarily? So we are more and more about appreciate the space and having it clean and cozy instead of having everything around us that is really, really building up on our space.
Thank you. Talking about happiness, maybe there's one more additional question on my side. Did reducing material possessions change how much pressure or comparison you feel in everyday life?
Yeah, I think so. Since we buy less and we decide more consciously against many things, I think there's also less concern about keeping up with others, or about having certain items. So actually, accumulating more things would just reduce our quality of life. So that's one reason why this does not really makes us feel bad, or it's more important to feel cozy and to feel this well-being and balanced than having more stuff.
For me as an architect or designer, it's always very important to get inspired by other works, other people, other brands, ideas, or maybe you can call it the trend of time. But also, it's very important to find your own way, even if it's based on the idea of how to live in our century or the change of design, the change of decoration. It's always the most important thing for me as an architect to ask, how do you want to live? How do I want to live? And which kind of rooms are very important to you? Maybe some people don't like the big living rooms. Some people really like small enclosed rooms with no window, maybe small windows. Some people really like the big windows. But if the environment around the site is not perfect, so you would look into a city, a jungle, or something which is really nice, but it could be really bad if you look into the street and people can watch you sitting there. So it's always a question of what do you really want, what do you really need? And I think that's the most important question on being happy at your own home.
Reducing possessions doesn't only change what we own, it also changes how we act, decide, and structure our lives. In psychological terms, this brings us directly to autonomy, the experience of making self-determined choices.
Exactly. So the question becomes not just what we own less of, but how much control we gain in return. As Leah already said, when we talk about autonomy, we basically mean the ability to make your own decisions without being controlled by anyone else. In psychology, autonomy is especially important in the self-determination theory. This theory argues that humans have three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when these needs are satisfied, people usually experience higher well-being and more healthy, self-driven motivation. So how do tiny houses deliver autonomy? There are a few key ways. First, there's financial autonomy. Tiny houses are typically much smaller and cheaper than conventional housing. That often means lower monthly costs, less rent or mortgage pressure, and sometimes less debt overall. And that financial relief can translate into more freedom in everyday life, because you're less dependent on a high income just to maintain your home. Second, tiny houses can create design and decision-making autonomy. Many tiny houses are owner-designed or heavily customized. Residents can actively shape the layout, storage solutions, lighting, and even daily routines around the space. That can increase a person's sense of perceived control, because the home is not something you just adapt to, but something you intentionally build or arrange to match your priorities and your lifestyle. In that sense, autonomy becomes very practical. It's reflected in how you use the space, what you keep, and how you live day to day. Third, there can be spatial or locational autonomy, especially with tiny houses on wheels. In principle, this mobility means you can change your location and adjust your environment over time, like moving closer to nature, work, or a certain community. However, this is also where the limits come in. In Germany, changing the location of your tiny house is not allowed, which reduces that mobility-based autonomy in practice. And that leads to the downsides of tiny houses and autonomy. Regulatory and zoning rules can strongly limit where and how people are actually allowed to live. Plus, space constraints can make privacy harder. There's less room to withdraw, and that can create a kind of crowding-like stress. To conclude this section, autonomy in tiny house living is real, but it's also shaped by legal frameworks and by the lived realities of small space. Following this theoretical input, we now move on to the corresponding questions for our interview partners. So the first question is, in what ways has living in a tiny house increased your sense of autonomy or control over your lifestyle?
Yeah, well, our autonomy has increased, but not in a complete or absolute way. Although the tiny house is built on a trailer, as we mentioned already, it's theoretically movable, but in reality, it is, of course, connected to standard utilities such as electricity and as well as fresh and wastewater systems. I think a strong sense of control comes really from the fact that we built the tiny house on our own. So it's our self-built home, and especially Patrick's extensive work in planning and constructing the tiny house gave us a lot of influence over how the tiny house was designed and how it functions. And yeah, I think this really increased our feeling of ownership and of control over our living environment.
That's really good. And do you feel that choosing a tiny house has given you more freedom, financially, emotionally, or in terms of daily decisions?
For sure. Financially, the tiny house has definitely given us more freedom. Because we invested a lot of personal labor into the planning and building process, we were able to save a significant amount of money. Instead of paying rent for an apartment, we used that money to pay off the tiny house itself. By now, we only pay utility and maintenance costs, which has reduced our financial pressure on a monthly basis considerably. Emotionally, living in our small self-built home is very fulfilling because there's a strong sense of pride and satisfaction in living in something we created ourselves. In terms of a daily decision, the freedom mainly shows in conscious choices, like we discussed before, what we buy, how we use space, and how we organize our everyday life.
That's really nice and really important. And the last question, how does the small scale of your home influence your routines and the way you structure your day?
Our daily routines have not really changed dramatically compared to when we lived in a rental apartment. However, certain tasks require more effort because, for example, we do not have a dishwasher anymore, and also we don't have a washing machine in the tiny house. So currently we are washing at my aunt's house, which is a few houses away. So there we have enough space to hang and dry the laundry. Also, while one might assume that cleaning a tiny house takes less time, I do not experience that much of a difference because some areas are harder to reach, and often some items need to be moved to clean. So yeah, I think it's almost more or less the same effort as before.
As a conclusion, we could say autonomy is often understood as independence from external, like financial or social constraints.
In addition to that, autonomy also shapes how we relate to our surroundings, including the environment we live in. This is where nature enters the picture. When we talk about tiny houses, we often immediately think about nature, forests, open landscapes, space to breathe. But from an environmental psychology perspective, it's actually not just about where a tiny house is located, it's about how present nature becomes in everyday life. One key theory is the attention restoration theory. They argue that our mental well-being suffers when we constantly have to focus, filter information, and stay alert, which is typical for urban environments. Nature works differently. It gently captures our attention through light, movement, sounds, or changing weather. And because it doesn't demand anything from us, it allows our mind to recover. Tiny houses can amplify exactly this effect. Because the living space is small, you're less shielded from your surroundings. Daylight, weather changes, even silence or wind becomes more noticeable. Nature isn't something you visit occasionally. It becomes part of your daily perception. And this doesn't only apply to tiny houses in remote natural settings. Research shows that even in urban environments, small natural elements can have a measurable impact on well-being. A view of the sky, plants, natural materials, or simply knowing that stepping outside is easy, all of this can support restoration and reduce stress. In a tiny house, these subtle cues often become more salient because there are less distraction competing for attention. What's interesting is that living small can actually make experiences feel bigger. Tiny houses reduce the barriers between us and our environment. Instead of controlling everything, temperature, light, noise, we become more aware of natural rhythms. This awareness can foster a sense of connection and groundedness. So in the end, living small doesn't mean giving something up. It can mean feeling big because nature, whether directly outside or subtly present, becomes a powerful source of well-being in everyday life. And so, has living in your tiny house brought you closer to nature in your daily life? And if so, how?
Yes, living in a tiny house has clearly brought us closer to nature in everyday life. The house is basically one open room with only a sliding door separating the bathroom from the living space. Everything else is open plan. When you enter through the front door, you immediately face a large window front that looks directly into the garden. I really enjoy looking out the window into nature. And for me, it feels much closer and more present than it ever did in a conventional house, or even if you have like a flat with a balcony or a terrace. Because of the size of the tiny house, it's definitely like living outside.
Maybe in addition to that, do you notice changes in your mood or stress levels when you spend more time outside your tiny house, or if you like feel the feeling of being almost outside, like you described?
No, not really. There are no obvious changes in our moods, I think. Yeah, because really, if you're inside a tiny house, it feels so close to nature, and through this visual connection, through the large windows, this makes it less noticeable that we spend a lot of time indoors. So also this helps to keep our stress levels relatively low, I think, because you're always connected to nature.
And how does your tiny house's location or design influence your connection to natural surroundings? I think maybe you already answered the question somehow, but maybe you want to add something to that.
The design of the tiny house plays a major role in strengthening the connection to nature. Because the space is mostly opened and oriented towards the garden, nature is always in our field of view. If you're working in the kitchen, you can look to the outside. If you're sitting on the couch, you can look to the outside. Even if you're laying in your bed, you have a picture frame looking over to the garden. There are no long hallways or closed rooms, so this is like this openness creates a feeling that the garden is part of the living space, actually, making the connection to nature more intense than in a typical house. And our terrace is also the typical extension into the garden. It's like a space in between outside and inside.
That sounds great. Since you talked a lot about your garden, how do the different seasons impact your life in a tiny house? And do they affect your quality of life, like your social life or the health and also the mood?
Yeah, the seasons have a noticeable impact on our daily life in the tiny house. So in summer, we naturally spend a lot of time outside on the terrace and in the garden. And in winter, of course, some aspects are a little bit more challenging. For example, it can be a little annoying when snow is brought into the house on shoes, since there's no buffer space like an entryway. And of course, it also had an impact on our social life, because we could just mainly invite friends over in summer or when the weather was good, because inside the tiny house, we can only host maximum 2 to 3 people before it feels really crowded. So we really always need to check the weather. However, this limitation has not had any negative effect on our friendships or on our overall mood. It's just, you just need to plan more carefully, or consider that you might change your plans. No, not friendships, but your plans. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. It's totally understandable, and also great that you don't think it has a negative impact on your
No.
life.
Not at all, no.
So, when we talk about connectedness to nature in the context of tiny houses, it's less about romantic ideas of living in the wilderness and more about how present nature becomes in everyday life. Living in a smaller space can change what we notice: daylight, weather, silence, movement outside, and even seasonal rhythms.
Instead of nature being something we visit occasionally, it can become something we experience continuously, often in subtle, everyday ways. And that's exactly what we'd like to explore with you now. As a last segment of questions, we want to ask you about the architecture and design of your tiny house. The first question for this last segment is, how did you deal with privacy, zoning, and multifunctionality?
Due to limitation of the size of our tiny house, because it was built on a trailer, we weren't really able to have like a floor plan that was divided into zoning or parts of the building. So we were limited to a size of 250 by 660. So there wasn't a lot of ideas to divide the space. So we thought about having all the space all together, but we wanted to at least divide the bathroom from all of the other rooms. So in floor plan, we have part of the house is like the kitchen with a dining area and a small couch, which is also used as like space to store. Then we have like a small sliding sliding door to the bathroom where our clothes are also stored. And on top of that, there's our bed. This is how we designed the house. But with all of these areas, you still have some privacy in the part of bathroom and sleeping area because of the slopiness of the roof, as well as the wall, the parting wall to the bathroom.
One question that came to my mind when you talked about the light, and you said that you can see the sunrise as well as the sunset, that maybe have an impact on your sleep rhythm. Like, do you actually wake up with the sunrise and go to bed with the
Sunset.
sunset?
No, not really. No.
But it's really nice to see the sunrise in the morning as well as having the sunset on dinner time.
Yeah, but of course we don't go to bed once the sunset is gone. So yeah, but you really feel a little more connected also again to nature because you really
follow the sun throughout the day.
Throughout the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, when it's like lunchtime at 12, you can't really be on the outside in the summer because it's very hot. So we needed to add some shading in summer. In winter, we are really happy when the sun's up. So we get direct sun into the room, and it's already helping mood, temperature, and yeah,
That
mood and
definitely
temperature.
that definitely sounds really nice. I can imagine a beautiful sunset.
To be honest, it's really important to think about the site where the tiny house is based. We are really lucky to have a site like ours because the floor, the site is about 900 square meters, and our tiny house has about 20. So the ratio is really, really good, and we don't have direct neighbors. So there is a lot of space in between public space and our private space.
Yeah, and there's also nothing like blocking your view or blocking the sun from coming into your house. That's really great. Thank you very much for joining us for our podcast. We really loved having you here, and it's really interesting for us to have these insights from you as you are living in a tiny house. We hope you enjoyed being on our podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and thank you so much for your interesting questions. It really made us think again of some topics we haven't discussed in a long time. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's come back to our guiding question. How does living in a tiny house enhance a psychological well-being through minimalism, autonomy, and connectedness to nature?
What we've seen is that tiny houses don't enhance well-being simply because they are small. They do so because they encourage intentional living, fewer possessions, more conscious choices, and a closer relationship with the environment. Minimalism reduces mental overload, autonomy strengthens self-determination, and connectedness to nature supports restoration and emotional balance. Together, these elements interact, and it is their combination that makes tiny house living psychologically meaningful.
This isn't just about tiny houses. We invite you to take this perspective into your own living environment. Ask yourself, where could you reduce excess, not only in things, but in routines and expectations?
Where could you increase autonomy in how you use your space, structure your day, or make decisions?
And how would you invite nature into your everyday life, through light, plants, materials, or simply spending more time outside?
In the end, the question is not whether everyone should live in a tiny house. It's whether living more intentionally, with less distraction, more autonomy, and a stronger connection to environment can enhance psychological well-being in a world that often feels overwhelming. Thanks for listening to Sustainable Voices. Let your voice drive change. If you like this podcast, check out the other episodes of Sustainable Voices.